Hi besties, I have a big news. Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds' messy marriage exposed, lawyers fumble during Baldoni deposition. MHM. See, right from the start, that opening comment already tells you everything you need to know about how dishonest this entire framing has been from the Blake Lively camp and her legal team, because the way this character is being described is very intentional. There's this obsession with not wanting her to appear like a delicate flower, not wanting the audience to see her as someone soft, gentle, open, vulnerable, or easily influenced, because the entire lawsuit narrative collapses the moment you admit that she is capable of standing on her own 2 feet and making her own decisions. The moment you accept that she's grounded, self-aware, and autonomous, you can no longer sell the idea that some dominant force came into her life, swept her off her feet, and dragged her down a path she didn't choose. That framing isn't accidental. That's the backbone of the victim narrative they're trying to construct, and it already contradicts itself because you can't simultaneously argue that she is strong, grounded, and in control while also arguing that she was manipulated, coerced, or overpowered by creative decisions she allegedly didn't consent to. Hi besties. Welcome back to the channel, because today we need to talk about what may genuinely be one of the most incompetent legal strategies I've seen attached to a high-profile celebrity lawsuit in a very long time. Blake Lively and her attorneys are not just losing control of the narrative, they never understood the source material to begin with, and the deposition testimony proves it. I'm not being dramatic when I say that their lack of preparation, their ignorance of the book, and their refusal to engage honestly with what's actually written on the page is actively sabotaging their own case. Now, let me be clear before anyone jumps down my throat, I am not a fan of Colleen Hoover's writing. I don't enjoy it. I don't think it's particularly good. I think it's repetitive, cliché, and relies heavily on tropes that romance readers have seen 1,000 times before. That said, whether I like the book or not is irrelevant, because facts are facts, and the book it ends with us contains very specific scenes that are now being deliberately misrepresented in this lawsuit. If you've read the book, and clearly Blake's legal team has not, you know exactly what scene everyone remembers. It's the infamous playing doctor moment between Ryle and Lily. It's intimate, it's cheesy, it's wildly cliché, and yes, it involves a stethoscope. No, it does not take place in a hospital. That's important. It happens outside of a hospital setting, but the dynamic, the dialogue, and the sexual tone are all there, plain as day, on the page, and yet somehow, during this deposition, we're being asked to pretend that any reference to playing doctor is some sort of gratuitous invention cooked up by Justin Baldoni to sneak in extra sex scenes, as if this man woke up one day and decided to turn a PG-13 adaptation into some kind of OnlyFans production. That framing is not just dishonest, it's insulting to anyone who actually read the book. Here's where things start to unravel. During the development process, while scenes were being rewritten, added, adjusted, and reworked, as literally every film adaptation does, there was discussion about a potential hospital scene. Not because someone wanted to be perverse, but because the production had already paid to secure hospital locations and needed to justify the cost with usable material. This is normal filmmaking. Producers do this all the time. You don't spend that kind of money on a location just to shoot 2 throwaway scenes. So when questions come up about scene 42, Boston Grace Hospital, neurosurgery floor, and whether a flirtatious exchange existed between Lily and Ryle, the answer isn't some scandalous gotcha. Yes, there was dialogue. Yes, it was playful. Yes, it leaned into sexual tension. And no, Justin Baldoni did not write it. That's not speculation. That's sworn testimony when asked directly who wrote that exchange, that "hello there, doctor" line, the playful banter. Justin states clearly that it was an idea from Christy Hall, developed during a 2-day meeting in his office at Wayfarer. He didn't deny liking it at the time. He didn't deny that it made sense within the script's development. What he denied was authorship, because it wasn't his, and this is where Blake Lively's attorneys start scrambling, because the lawsuit claims Justin added these scenes. The deposition proves he didn't. Now they're forced to pivot, asking whether Blake liked the scene, whether anyone objected, whether it was later removed. And yes, it was taken out, largely because Blake didn't like it. Not because it was inappropriate, not because it was some shocking deviation from the book, but because she personally didn't want it included. That distinction matters. Even more damaging is the admission that Sony requested the film be sexier. That wasn't just in freelancing. That was studio direction. And the team had to balance those notes against budget constraints, location limitations, and time restrictions. So when Christy Hall suggested leaning into a playing doctor dynamic, something already rooted in the book, it wasn't some rogue decision. It was an adaptation choice driven by studio pressure and logistical reality, and here's the kicker, they were constantly referring back to the book to guide these decisions. Let that sink in. The same book Blake's team is now pretending doesn't contain this material was actively being used as a reference point to increase the sexual tension between Ryle and Lily, while keeping Atlas and Lily's relationship more romantic and emotionally driven. That contrast is intentional. It's central to the story. Anyone who's read the book knows that Ryle and Lily's relationship is heavily sexualized early on. So when the deposition asks, is there a scene in the book where they play doctor in a hospital and have sex in an exam room, the answer is no, but that question itself is misleading. Because the book doesn't need to place it in a hospital to be explicit. It places it in a floral shop, and what happens there is far more graphic than anything even hinted at in the film, and that's where Blake's entire argument collapses, because when you actually read chapter 13, and yes, I did, you see that this scene is not subtle. Ryle shows up in scrubs. He has a stethoscope. There's flirtation, physical intimacy, and explicit sexual activity described in detail. This isn't implication. This isn't subtext. It's on the page. They don't have sex in a hospital exam room, but they absolutely engage in a sexual role-play scenario involving medical imagery, power dynamics, and explicit physical acts. And if we're being honest, it's far more graphic than anything that ever made it into the PG-13 movie. So the idea that adapting a toned-down version of that dynamic is gratuitous is laughable. What's actually happening here is that people who never read the book, including Blake's own attorneys, are reacting to isolated phrases like playing doctor without understanding the context. They're treating it as though it's inherently obscene, when in reality it's pulled directly from the source material and significantly sanitized for film, and that's just the first layer of incompetence. And this is where the deposition stops being about a script dispute and starts becoming a character study, because once you move past the playing doctor and nonsense and actually listen to the testimony about the intimacy scenes, the real issue comes into focus, and it has nothing to do with whether a scene was gratuitous or faithful to the book. The real issue is control. Control over narrative, control over perception, control over who gets blamed, and ultimately control over who gets punished for refusing to play along. When the questioning shifts to the intimacy coordinator, you can feel the legal strategy wobble. They start circling around the idea of climax timing, framing it like this shocking, inappropriate creative choice, as if the very discussion of how a scene ends is evidence of misconduct. And again, anyone who has worked in film or television knows how absurd that framing is. These conversations happen on literally every production that involves intimacy. That's the entire reason intimacy coordinators exist. Their job is to talk through these details so actors are not surprised on set, and so scenes are handled deliberately rather than recklessly. So when Justin explains that he discussed every intimate scene with the intimacy coordinator, that should have been the end of that line of questioning. Instead, it becomes the setup for another narrative pivot. They ask whether anyone else on cast or crew was involved in these discussions. He answers honestly, Christy Hall, the intimacy coordinator, and eventually Blake Lively herself, and that's where things get uncomfortable for Blake's legal team, because Justin doesn't say Blake was blindsided. He doesn't say she was shocked. He doesn't say she objected on moral grounds. What he says is that when one particular idea was discussed, an idea rooted in centering female pleasure on screen, Blake made it personal, not professional. Personal, the idea being discussed, according to testimony, was that Lily might climax while Ryle does not, and that the moment would end with him acknowledging that watching her was enough. The intent, as explained clearly, was to explore something rarely shown on screen from a female perspective, something that would feel authentic to the female gaze rather than performative for a male audience. Whether you like that idea or not is irrelevant. What matters is how Blake responded. Instead of keeping the conversation within the professional context of the character, she reportedly said, "Oh God, that would mortify me if that happened to me." Not Lily. Her, and that distinction is critical, because the moment she makes it about herself, the entire dynamic shifts. Justin responds as many adults would in that situation, sharing that some of the most meaningful moments he's experienced with his wife came from similar situations. Not graphic. Not explicit. Just contextualizing the idea in a way that normalizes it, and according to his testimony, that was it. The conversation ended. No pressure. No insistence. No escalation, and yet somehow, this exchange is being reframed as evidence of impropriety. Ask yourself why, because when you actually break it down, what Blake did in that meeting was blur the line between character and self. She personalized a hypothetical scene and then reacted emotionally to her own projection. That's not misconduct by the director. That's an actress inserting her personal discomfort into a creative discussion and then later reframing that discomfort as something done to her rather than something she expressed herself. And here's where the legal consequences start stacking up. The attorneys then ask whether Justin told Blake that Christy Hall was working on the drafts during April 2023. His answer is honest but imperfect. Blake was on spring break, communication was limited, but he imagines he did tell her, because he frequently told her he wasn't a writer and that he was navigating a role he didn't normally occupy. That answer is devastating for Blake's case, because it exposes a fatal inconsistency. In the lawsuit, Blake claims Justin wrote these scenes. In the deposition, Justin states Christy Hall wrote them, and now her lawyers are trying to figure out when Blake learned that fact, because if she knew at the time, or reasonably should have known, then the claim that Justin unilaterally inserted these scenes collapses entirely. This is the moment you can practically hear the legal team realizing they have a problem, because this isn't a misunderstanding. It's a pattern. Blake tells Access Hollywood that her husband wrote the rooftop scene. She tells Wayfarer that she wrote it herself. She tells her lawyers that Justin wrote the sex scenes. Justin testifies that Christy Hall wrote them. These are not small discrepancies. These are fundamental contradictions about authorship and intent, and at some point, you have to confront the obvious conclusion: Blake Lively is not a reliable narrator. That doesn't mean she's malicious. It doesn't mean she's lying with intent every time. But it does mean that her recollections shift depending on audience, context, and outcome. And that's deadly in a legal setting. And now let's talk about the elephant in the room that nobody wants to name directly, Ryan Reynolds, because the deeper you get into this deposition, the clearer it becomes that this case isn't driven by Blake's discomfort alone. It's driven by someone else's suspicion, someone else's jealousy, someone else's need to control the environment. The obsession with these scenes that are toned-down versions of material explicitly present in the book, makes no sense unless you view them through that lens. Because if the concern were truly about fidelity to the source material or professional boundaries, the argument would fall apart the moment someone actually read Chapter 13. Instead, the fixation is on motive, on intent, on the implication that Justin wanted to insert these scenes because he wanted Blake. That's the subtext of nearly every question. Did you write it? Why did you want it? What did you get out of it? And that framing only makes sense if someone behind the scenes is convinced that this wasn't about storytelling, it was about access. Which brings us to the uncomfortable conclusion that this entire legal strategy appears to be driven by Ryan Reynolds' insecurity rather than any objective misconduct, because the pattern is clear. As Ryan becomes more involved, scenes get cut. Intimacy gets reduced. Physical interaction gets limited. Creative control shifts. And the justification isn't narrative coherence, it's protection. Protection from what? From Blake catching feelings. From another man kissing his wife. From the possibility that the on-screen chemistry might bleed into something he can't control, and that's not a professional concern. That's a personal one. What's being reframed as saving Blake from exploitation looks an awful lot like policing her interactions under the guise of moral outrage. The language is about consent and safety, but the behavior is about possession and dominance. And here's the bitter irony: the lawsuit accuses Justin of exactly what Ryan appears to be doing, controlling the narrative, controlling the script, controlling who touches Blake, controlling how the story is told, all while accusing someone else of manipulation. By the end of this deposition, it's painfully obvious that the so-called gratuitous sex scenes were not added by Justin. That playing doctor dynamic was rooted in the book. The studio asked for more sexuality. Christy Hall contributed the ideas. The intimacy coordinator approved the discussions. Blake participated in the conversations, and yet, somehow, Justin is being painted as the villain who wanted a piece of Blake. That accusation isn't supported by testimony. It isn't supported by evidence. And it certainly isn't supported by the source material. What is supported is the idea that this case is being driven by paranoia, insecurity, and an obsessive need to control perception at all costs. It's not just about winning a lawsuit. It's about preserving an image, maintaining dominance, and rewriting reality so that no one ever has to admit the truth, and the truth is simple: this isn't incompetence alone. It's entitlement layered on top of insecurity, wrapped in legal theatrics, and sold as righteousness. So yeah, when you ask me what I think about the level of incompetence and jealousy on display here, my answer is that it's staggering. Not because mistakes were made, but because the entire strategy is built on a foundation that collapses the moment you read the book, listen to the testimony, or apply even a shred of logic. Drop your thoughts in the comments, like the video, subscribe if you haven't already, hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching, besties.